Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Gargi, and today I am here with the author Intisar Khanani as well as Miss from Qamar Book Tours. Intisar Khanani is the author of Thorn, the Sunbolt Chronicles, as well as Dragon Slayer number 9, and she has a book upcoming in March, which we'll be talking about. So this interview is in association with Qamar Book Tours. I'm on the tour for The Theft of Sunlight, which is releasing on 23rd March 2021. And I'll hand it over to Miss so that she can talk a little bit about her company.
Okay. Hello, people of the world. My name is Miss. I am a writer, a reader, a science fiction and fantasy junkie, and you might have seen me somewhere in the YouTube sphere. I am also one of the organizers at Qamar Blog Tours, and at Qamar Blog Tours, we basically make sure that Muslim authors are getting all the love that they deserve. And we are so excited to conduct this book tour for Intisar and for her new book, upcoming book. I'm so excited for it, and I cannot wait to be a part of this interview. I will not really be doing much. I'll kind of just be lurking in the background and giving Gargi and Intisar some space to talk and like get to know each other. All right. So yeah, over to you, Gargi.
Thanks, Miss. Okay, so hi, Intisar. How are you doing? Could you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name is Intisar. I write young adult fantasy. My tagline is I write mighty girls and diverse worlds. I was indie published for about 8 years, and then HarperTeen picked up my indie debut and republished it after I fully revised it. It was called Thorn. It's a retelling of The Goose Girl. And they also picked up a second book for me, which is A Theft of Sunlight, which is coming out this March. And I thought it was going to be one book, but it turned into a duology. But it is not based on a fairy tale. It's my own story. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you so much for welcoming me onto your channel.
Thank you so much for being here. We are really excited for Theft of Sunlight as well as its untitled sequel. And okay, so let's get into the question, shall we? Right. So since Thorn is, like you said, it is a Goose Girl retelling. So what inspired you to write a fairy tale retelling? What kind of a perspective, like a new perspective, did you want to bring to the world of fairy tales?
It makes it sound like I was really knew what I was doing. This question, I actually wrote Thorn my senior year of university. I had always wanted to be a novelist, and I decided that if I wanted to write a book, I should just go ahead and do that. And honestly, in retrospect, I have no idea what I was thinking. I was taking an overload of classes because I transferred universities. I was working a 20-hour-a-week job. I was in charge of a couple of clubs, and I was like, obviously, I should write a book right now. And I thought that if I picked a story that I already knew and loved, that it would be a relatively easy process to write a book. I was extremely naive. Um, I picked The Goose Girl because it wasn't a story I'd seen retold at that point. This was predating Shannon Hale's retelling. And it's such a weird story. You know, there's a lot of, in the original tale, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense. And so it had a lot of room to explore and kind of make it your own and create your own logic. And so I really enjoyed that. And my first draft was horrible. I printed it out at my university lab, as one does, and I sat down to read it, and I literally almost fell asleep reading it. It was so boring. And so that's where I learned that, like, actually, even if you already have a plot, that does not make writing easy. And so I spent quite a few years revising it and making it something that told a story I wanted to tell. And I think part of that was the journey I was on. So I wrote it, my senior year of university was the year of 9/11. And so over the ensuing years, I was really struggling with questions of compassion and mercy and justice, and what is justice and what is a cycle of violence. And those are themes that you see come out very clearly in Thorn, although there's no terrorism, thankfully, in the story. But I think those are all themes that we can see anywhere we go. And so that is kind of where my mark came from, and it was more of me learning to process the things I was struggling with at that time and building them into the story I was working on.
Yeah, I think all of the thinking that went behind it, it shows really well in Thorn. I read it recently and I was like, this is not something you really see in fairy tales. And I really liked how there was a lot of depth to the society that existed there. And there were, bad elements as well as good elements. And I think you brought all of it out really well.
Thank you.
Okay. So, like you mentioned, you wrote your first draft of Thorn in uni, which is like, I cannot imagine doing that. It's uni is just, wow, it's a mess. I cannot imagine doing that at all. So you mentioned that I think in your acknowledgments you mentioned that it took you like a long time to get from your first draft to your final draft. So how has your process changed since then? You have written a bunch of books since you wrote Thorn for the first time, and now with The Theft of Sunlight. How did it all change? And with The Theft of Sunlight, since you already introduced the character of Amraeya in the bone knife, did it make it easier? Did it help you find the voice in an easy way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so my process overall, I feel like there's two questions. One is kind of a process question, and the other is how I built this Theft of Sunlight and Ray. So the process question, I think, I've continued to learn and grow as a writer, and I definitely have figured out just, things like when I need to sit down and face an emotionally hard truth in the story, and when it's really okay to walk away from it and do something else for a little while. I've learned at what point I need to just push through and at what point I need to step back and process. So that's actually helped me a lot. Every writer is very, very different, and we write in the way that our personality is wired. And I'm sure you've heard like terms like pantsing or plotting, and I'm kind of in between. I can't quite pants and I can't quite plot. And so, over the course of 10 or 15 years, I've figured out the mix of processes that actually helps me to be most efficient, which is, it's, it's your own secret sauce for every writer, like how you plot and or not plot, and how you get that story down in a way that is alive and exciting, and also efficient. So, like you said, I went through probably a dozen drafts of Thorn before I indie published it, and I was learning to write that whole time. Thorn was my first book. I wrote 7 or 8 other manuscripts along the way, but I kept coming back to Thorn. For some reason, it really resonated with me, and it was a story I knew I actually wanted to share at some point. And not all of those dozen drafts actually went through to completion, and that's something else I learned, which was that I actually do need to take drafts to completion. um, so I think the thing about being a writer is it takes a little while to figure out how your brain works. And, we have a tendency to look at like writers we admire, and we're like, oh, what do you do? Because clearly that's going to work for me. And it's not how it works, right? So you have to learn to trust your own process and experiment and find your process. I feel like, it's literally been 19 years since I first drafted Thorn now. And I've finally, honestly, this winter felt like I finally have a handle on my process. So books are much faster now, but that doesn't actually mean they're fast. They're just faster than Thorn ever was. The Theft of Sunlight was super intriguing to write. I wrote the bone knife to get a handle on Amraeya. Her nickname is Ray in the story. Her life and her family, because I was at a point where I was really tired of the very typical YA trope of either the family has to be horrible or dead or missing, and then we can have a great YA adventure. And I'm like, what about happy families? Like, my family is not horrible or dead or missing. and I still have a good life, like in adventures. So why can't my character? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Like, frankly, Alira's family is horrible, and once they're missing from her life, life is much better. But I think we do our young people a disservice when we don't acknowledge that families can actually be an active and healthy part of your coming into yourself and coming into your own agency and power and having your own adventures. Like, you don't have to like shut the door on your family in order to grow up. And so I wanted to figure out what a happy family actually looked like in fantasy, and I was really stumped, and I wrote The Bone Knife literally as an exercise to figure out what a happy family would look like that cared and loved each other, but you still like went off and did things that maybe you shouldn't really do and had adventures. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. I really like your thinking of, having a happy family for your protagonist, because yeah, I definitely agree with, there is like an abundance of tortured characters who have like horrible families or dead families. They just have so much trauma with regards to their families. And
And
it's
I've
nice.
written them. I'm not saying that there's no place for that story, but like we also need the counterpoint.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So yeah. So now that we're talking about family trauma, so your writing has included some very sensitive topics like physical and sexual violence against women. There's physical and sexual violence against women, and to an extent, human trafficking, and with the theft of sunlight, form of disability. So, how do you write them in a way that is respectful and sensitive to the readers?
Um, the first thing I do is I do my best to do research and put myself in the shoes of people who have experienced this. So, writing abuse, writing, surviving assault, and things like sexual violence and all in Thorn, they happen off page, but they happen, and they happen in real life. And I think part of addressing these themes is recognizing that these are real things that happen in real life, and young people are going to come up against them, and you can't sugarcoat them. But we do have to engage with them in a respectful manner, as you said. So I do a lot of research, even with like human trafficking. I'm very blessed. I live here in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where the Underground Railroad passed over from Kentucky. And once enslaved peoples reached the Ohio shore, they were technically free, although they could be reclaimed by bounty hunters or slavers. And so they would have to continue to run to Canada. But there's a place here on the banks of the Ohio River called the the Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And they have, 2 floors of exhibits on slavery in the US and the history of slavery in the US. And then they have an exhibit on modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I spent a lot of time there reading the stories, engaging with what human trafficking looks like and feels like, in order to build it into theft. And even though theft is, it's set in a fantasy kingdom, and we don't see too much actually happening. We encounter a few people that have to be rescued, but beyond that, like it's very kind of amorphous, and so a lot of that was based on research and reading and reaching out to organizations and trying to understand how human trafficking works in the real world. And it isn't set up the same in theft. I mean, there's no circle of mages, there's no magic, there's no, this is, we don't live in a fantasy land here in the real world. uh, but the human experience of trafficking is going to be the same whether there's magic or not. And so really it's an exercise in empathy and compassion, trying to understand what people went through. In terms of disability, the same thing. I did a lot of research. I read what I could, and then I also reached out to sensitivity readers, and I had 2 sensitivity readers review the whole draft and give me feedback before we got to the point of publication, because again, you want to be as respectful as you can um, in 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 all of these different aspects.
Right. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I agree with your the what you said about them being exercises in empathy, because I think I noticed that a lot when I was reading both Thorn and Theft of Sunlight. A lot of the story revolves around the reader as well as the protagonist having empathy towards other people. So yeah, I think that you did that really well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the comparison between Thorn and Theft of Sunlight. Since they are set in the same world, there is going to be some of that. So there
Yeah.
is, yeah. So what I noticed was there was like a very nice contrast between Amraeya and Alira,
Mhm.
like with the kind of personalities they have, the kind of backgrounds they have, and the kind of protagonists that they are. So,
Mhm.
how did you set the tone and change the voice of the story with Theft of Sunlight from Thorn?
Um, I'm not sure it was fully conscious. And part of this is honestly going back to the fact that I wrote Thorn, 19 years ago. I started drafting Theft about 10 years ago, and then I ended up setting it aside because I couldn't figure out the heart of the story. There was something missing, and by the heart of the story, I mean the emotional kind of heart of the story. But I knew Ray was going to be different from Illyra. Illyra came from this very traumatic background, and her story is about coming into herself and gaining her own voice and strength to stand up for what she believes in and to stand up for herself. Ray doesn't have that background, and so I don't really know where Ray came from. Sometimes every writer's different. So for me, sometimes I wake up um, and there's someone talking in my head, and all I can do is kind of sit down and start writing scenes with them and get to know them. And I think that's what I did with Ray, and that's why I wrote The Bone Knife, was to get to know Ray and her family. Literally, like I was trying to meet them, so I wrote the story to meet them. um, I because Ray doesn't have the same background as Lair. She has other hangups and other kinds of trauma in a certain sense that she has to deal with. But she's the protective older sister, and we always have these stories where it's like the younger sister who goes off and has the adventure, and she's special and she's pretty and she has the magical powers. And you know, I wanted a story where the dour, practical, plain-faced older sister is going to save the world, because that's what older sisters do, right? They hold it together, they take care of everyone in the family, and dang it, if someone has to stop people from snatching children off the street, then I guess I'll have to do it. Um, and so her personality kind of came out, I think, in part to suit the story, and in part just because innately she just started speaking to me as the person she is. Um, and I suspect in a certain sense I was looking for her. I didn't know what she was going to look like when she stepped out of the page.
Okay. Well, that is something. I thought that there was this contrast of Alira being from this, well, horrible family, and then Amraya being from this happy family. Although family dynamics are definitely like they cannot be set in stone very easily. So like they're not exactly the best family there is. They have their own problems, but
Happy doesn't
yeah,
mean untroubled, right?
yeah,
Happy doesn't mean perfect. Like none of
yeah,
us have a perfect family. We all have fights with family. We all have times when we don't value our family the way we should. But overall, like this is a family that cares about each other. So
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And
I
again, we talked about how I was trying to get away from that trope of like you've got to get rid of your family to have an adventure. And Ray certainly travels, but she brings her family with her when she travels.
yeah.
Um, and
I
sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think that there was a lot of like these outside ideas and like responses to tropes and realities that were percolating in me as I was getting to know Ray. And so I'm sure it all came together, but like I wouldn't say it was conscious. It was my subconscious doing me some favors.
Okay. All right. So let's wrap this up. So I would just like you to give like an elevator pitch for Tons of Sunlight or anything, just like any way you want to describe it as formal, informal, fun, normally, any way you like.
Yeah, so The Theft of Sunlight is about Ray. And her best friend's little sister is snatched from the streets of their little town. And it brings home to Ray the reality that children are disappearing across her kingdom. And so she gets the chance to travel to the king's city and stay with her cousin in the court. She takes it primarily so she can find out what's happening and kind of push for things to be done. And she ends up with drawing the attention of Valera from Thorn, who has been looking for someone just like Ray. And so Ray is then takes on the task of actually doing the work rather than just asking the questions. And she runs across a number of familiar characters and as well as new faces. And it's really a story of when we're taking on something so much bigger than yourself. How do you even start? Where do you go? And at what point do you realize you're in way too deep? So it is an adventure story. There are street thieves. There's a tax clerk because unraveling mysteries is not all like adventure on the streets. It's also like sitting down in the record room and like going through hours and hours and hours of documentation. So so it's just it's a different kind of story from Thorn very much, but it's also it's my dour, very dry humor older sister taking on the world because someone has to.
Oh, I am really excited for it. I had a great time reading it. So just
Thank
for our viewers, The Theft of Sunlight releases on March 23rd, 2021. Look out for it, pre-order it, hype it up. Yeah, there it is, just a beautiful cover. So I would like to thank Qamar Book Tours for having me on the tour for The Theft of Sunlight. And thank you so much, Intisar, for joining me and along with Miss. It was great having you here and talking to you. And we can't wait to see what new worlds you think up of.
you so much. Thank you for having me.